good afternoon. Welcome to Beyond the Table, a show where we sit around and we hang out and we talk with people who design the games we love. And I have the pleasure and the honor of sitting here with Tim Brown. Tim, welcome to Beyond the Table.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, JM.
Now, so if you guys don't know, Timothy Brian Brown has worked on a ton of projects. On his career, he started at Games Design Workshop, which we're going to talk about, but I think you probably are most famous in the gaming industry as one of the creators of Dark Sun.
Yeah, that's one of the major feathers in my role-playing game.
Now, the irony, not the irony, like I've had the pleasure of knowing you for quite some time because we started. I actually started Iconic Podcast. The very first interview that I did was with you for your Dragon Kings Kickstarter, and now we've worked on many projects together.
We have, yeah. See how that works? You got drawn in, didn't you?
I did. I got drawn in. So why don't you tell us about yourself? Tell us about like how did you get involved in gaming?
How did I get involved in gaming? Oh, okay. Well, that goes way back. So yeah, in my misspent youth, and I do mean youth. It's just a young guy. My older brother and I got into the various board games put out by like Avalon Hill and SPI. So we were playing, Panzer Blitz, Fall of France, and all these different games like that. We thought they were a lot of fun. I had an uncle who was not a whole lot older than my brother and I, who was also into them, and he introduced us to a lot of stuff, and we really dove in. It was a ton of fun. We got a number of mutual friends around our hometown that we got playing with them as well. So we had a fairly good group of people to get together and play what were mostly strategic military board games. So there were some multiplayer games in there as well that got more time went on. But one of those companions of ours, who was a longtime gamer friend, well, one summer he had to move away. Okay, so he and his family moved away, and I think the next year he came back for a visit. And when he came back from that visit, he said, "Well, I got introduced to this whole different kind of Dungeons and Dragons, and I had no idea what that was." And he just described it really briefly in a conversation I'll remember to this day, where he said, "Yeah, it's hard to describe. It's like pretend you're like this warrior, and you go into this fantasy dungeon, and then you kill this monster, and you take its treasure, and on the way back out of the dungeon with that treasure, half that treasure turns into another monster, and you have to kill that too." And I'm like, well, this seems very strange. I don't know anything about it, but it was intriguing enough that I decided to go looking for it. And that sent me back to our local hobby store where we bought most of our board games. And it turns out, my goodness, right there next to those board games, they actually had the little white box 3-book set. It wasn't the first edition; it was a slightly later edition. But I snagged that, and they had Dragon Magazine. I bought Dragon Magazine number 3, brand new, right there in the store, and dragged all that stuff home and started reading. And of course, I was taken with D&D at the time, but that didn't change how much we loved all the board games and stuff too. And part of that was we knew that the biggest maker of such board games was Avalon Hill. They were very well established at the time with huge line. And then SPI, those were a little harder to come by, but you could get them a lot by mail and stuff like that. And they had a zillion titles as well. So it was an amazingly time-consuming hobby. But we were kids; we had all the time in the world. So.
Oh yeah, I remember my Omaha Beachhead game would take just as long to set up with all of the chits.
I got into gaming through board games like Avalon Hill and SPI, and they had their magazine Strategy and Tactics. And in the back, they had sort of a want ad section, and we looked at one that got our attention because I can't remember what it is. This basically said, "You come join the Greater Bloomington Normal Game Designers Protection Association." Well, I lived in Bloomington Normal, Illinois, so I was like, "What is this ad?" And it turns out it was basically a ruse or a little bit of bait stuck into S&T magazine by the guys at Game Designers Workshop. They're in my very hometown. I didn't even know they existed. Um, but it turns out the third largest creator of those great big board games that I was so in love with was right there in my hometown, just across town on the campus of Illinois State University. They had an office over there. So I learned of their existence. I went over. It turns out they kind of put that ad in S&T magazine, hoping to attract playtesters, people who would come and play test games that were in development. And I was just like a kid in a candy store. I tell you what, they probably regret to this day placing an ad like that because it attracted me. And I made a nuisance of myself for some time over there, and uh, got to get involved in the playtest of a lot of games. So we talked about the military board games I was into
Mhm.
from Avalon Hill and such. Well, of course, GDW was making a lot of things like that.
Oh, yeah.
I got to playtest one of the early versions of one of their Europa games. I remember playing Case White, which was the Invasion of Poland game that they made. All hand-drawn counters on a hand-drawn
Oh,
map.
man. Yeah.
It's just in its infancy, like that. The same was true of the original Imperium board game that Mark Miller put together. Yeah, it's just a hand-drawn map, and it was just so primitive. That this is before making things on computers. It was all
Right.
just
Yeah.
so raw and so interesting. And I got to do all of those things, and it was all for the doing it. And you got a copy of the game when it came out, that sort of thing. And I just did dozens of those. But it was a real introduction to what those guys were doing. And of course, I was just a kid that wanted to worm my way into that process somehow because I found it so fascinating to see how Rich Banner got all of the art created and how he made all those graphics and how the designers like Mark Miller and Frank Chadwick were creating the different board games that they were making. Some of the other guys who were there, particularly Lauren Wiseman and John Harshman, who were great game guys and developers. I just started hanging out with these guys who were all quite a bit older than me. I was just a child, just 11, 12, 13 years old hanging out with these guys. But yeah, they let me do that, and I got to figure out how to run stuff like run the typesetting equipment and figure out how to set things up and how to write a manuscript and get it into the primitive word processing equipment that we had at the time and all of that. Whole different ball game, but
Yeah.
very informative and fun to get in on the ground level. And those are the things that propelled me not only into just a greater interest in gaming as a hobby, but hey, maybe this is something I can make a career
Yeah.
out of because it's terribly interesting. If not this, then some other kind of publishing. But I learned a lot and had a lot of fun. So that's what got me into the board gaming, got me into the industry, got me into role playing games where uh, we started playing Dungeons and Dragons amongst me and my friends, but I knew at the same time they were developing the Traveler game over at GDW. This was just coming out, and when it did, I was like, this is awesome. It's a whole different kind of thing, but it's sci-fi, and yeah, I was really taken with it. It was just a ton of fun. So
So how did
not the
you
typical story.
right?
Yeah.
How did you go from that to working at GDW? And what were some of the games that you worked on? Some of your projects, some of the things you loved about your time there at
Sure.
GDW.
Well, I did a ton of play testing, as I said, and that went on for years where, like at least once a week or something like that, we'd go over there and whatever game was available to be played, we'd tinker around with that. Um, then, as I got more into a working age, I actually started working at their warehouse. They always needed help. We had a warehouse right there in town where printed materials would come in and they would have to be packaged into games, put the components in the box, get those ready for shipment, take care of shipping, things like that. And I did that sort of as a part-time thing after school, pretty much through my entire high school career. And I found that far more interesting than anything else I was doing in school. I mean, I was always dabbling in music at the same time, but this was my job. This was something that I was just a ton of fun. And then we would get together with the same group of guys at GDW and play all kinds of multiplayer games like the old Dune game and
Mm-hmm.
things like Diplomacy and such like that. It was a great social thing to do in those days as well. Um, but from that warehouse position, I was always working on, hey, can I help contribute to this project or to that. I eventually got to write some of the original Traveler books. I made the Fighting Ships book, was my first published book. It was either
That's
80 or
awesome.
81, I can't remember. which was a lot of fun. It was, in fact, that's how I met and first worked with Paul, later Janelle Jaques, who unfortunately we lost just recently, which is a tragedy. But Janelle created all the sketches, and actually I made sketches, and Janelle turned back around and created the finished art pieces and sent them back. Of course, they were vastly improved from, I'm no artist. I wasn't then, I'm not now, but I sketched out the various starships, and we worked together to bring those to fruition. So moving forward from that, I got involved with a lot more of the Traveler stuff, was writing articles for the Journal of the Traveler's Aid Society, which later became Challenge magazine.
Yep.
And I slowly wormed my way in and started doing more and more on different Traveler projects, contributed to like the Alien Worlds book and several of the early books there. Had a lot of proofreading and just other editorial work that I did on a number of early Traveler things, as they would allow me to do that. But I didn't get really completely invested in my own sort of creative project until the 2300 AD universe was really, in the making.
Yeah, I've got that book, or I got that box set.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. The genesis of that project was earlier. Frank and Mark had put together the Twilight 2000 universe, which is at the time, a near future. Now it's the recent, history has passed it by, of course, numerically speaking. But at the time, it was a near future. There's been a war in Europe, and you play as soldiers in Poland, American soldiers basically trying to get their way back after a third world war has essentially ground to a halt in Europe. And it was a setting that attracted a whole new brand of role player who wanted to do some more realistic kinds of things. And I think it was Frank's idea at first let's create a science fiction universe that is set in that same world where that war has transpired. And then by the year 2300, there's been some kind of space travel has been developed, and everything goes off world out. It wasn't Traveler, but a different future experience. And so I got to be part of the design team on that with Lester Smith and Mark and Frank. And we put that all together, and it's, to my mind, it's about as hard a science fiction game as has ever been created. Though it still presupposes a faster than light drive and all of that. But to the extent that we could, we tried to keep it as within real science as we possibly could, and something that was realistic and believable and expanded upon all of these earthly nations and who got to go to space first. But those who know the history of the game probably know that to create the actual future history, as you might expect, Frank actually put together a gigantic board that it would take up my whole office floor if we were to set it out, and made a map of the Earth and sketched out all of the countries and made little areas and this whole set of rules and everything else where we all played as a multiplayer game. Everybody around the office at GDW played this, we called it the game, which wasted a lot of our time, I might say. But
it was for research purposes.
It was for research, but boy, we all got so involved in it that it was to the exclusion of a lot of work that was supposed to be done otherwise. I'll tell you that. But it was so compelling and so interesting, and we played different countries and basically gamed out the next 300 years of history, starting with that aftermath of the limited war, and then move forward through time. And I remember we had to play multiple nations. I believe I was Great Britain and part of a fractured China. I played those, and then everybody else was all these different countries, and played out what became the future history that's written up in 2300 AD.
Oh, that's awesome!
It was amazing. Everybody really, really enjoyed it. It even had the initial part of who got space travel first and faster than light travel first, and the ramifications of that. And we all start playing out, well, who gets to take over these worlds, and we had these summits, and it was nuts. It was That alone, if we could get together all of the notes, I wish more was documented because it would make a great telling in and of itself.
Oh, it
But
would, yeah. And for those of you
yeah,
who've never played a game
well,
like that, like, and these are the games of like diplomacy that stick in my head, the games of Dune, Fantasy Flight's Game of Thrones. Uh, there is nothing like them. And also, I have never played the same game with the exact same group of people twice, because inevitably someone's like, never again. I'm done
yeah.
with
Well,
this group
that's
of
I'll
people.
tell you. Yeah, well, if you're going to play diplomacy, where essentially you're going to lie to everybody,
Uh-huh.
yeah, you better be good friends. I'll tell you that because
They
it
had
can lead to some hard feelings.
it was for the 50th anniversary, I think it was, like, probably a
Yeah.
decade or 15 years ago. They ran the ad, destroying friendships for 50 years was the tagline for diplomacy. And I'm like, that is
Yeah.
some truth in advertising right there.
Well, I'll tell you what, I got so involved in diplomacy over the years that uh, there's ways to play it on,
Hmm.
just
Oh, yeah.
by email or whatever. Um, and those games, people get so vested, and uh, I think the game is least destructive when you basically sit down and play it face to face, where your time investment is large, but at least it's finite.
Yes.
That over the course of a day, you kind of put the whole game behind you. Yeah, whatever bad feelings there are, they're just in that. These longer games that are played over the mail or the internet or whatever, people get vested in them. They put days, weeks, and months of time into playing this game and are so invested in it that, boy, when they finally get stabbed in the back, and 6 people out of 7 in that game will,
Uh-huh.
right, get stabbed in the
100%.
back. Um, yeah, they're just incensed. I mean, the feelings can get very hard.
Oh, yeah.
And well, yeah,
We used to, at the game store that I managed, we had 2 diplomacy seasons. We'd play in the spring and
hmm
we'd play in the fall because that gave about 3 months for tempers to cool
yeah,
back down. But it was one move. We did one move a week, and
okay,
so
yeah,
I mean that ends up taking quite a while to
right,
get through. And oh
right.
man, yeah. John Doom says Twilight Imperium kind of a backstab space simulator, a little bit, but I gotta
Yeah.
tell you, there is something special about diplomacy where there's no dice. It comes down to, did the person you make a deal with lie to your face or not?
Yep. Yeah, there's no dice for luck in that game. That's just, here were the moves that were submitted. Here's the results. Move on.
Move on.
That's it.
Yeah. Suck it up and
So
take your
yeah,
next turn. Yeah. All right. So
ton
how
of
did you
fun.
go
Ton of fun.
from GDW into TSR? Because again, I think for most of us in the gaming sphere, Dark Sun
Mhm.
is the thing that we
Oh, sure.
yeah. So how did that move happen? How did you get involved in Dark Sun? What was it
Um,
like in the TSR days?
yeah. Well, the transition, I guess, from GDW. Of course, we went to all of the game conventions.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been going to Gen Cons and the Origins conventions since the late '70s, which is crazy to think now. But um, through the '80s, as we were doing a lot more and more things, and going, I was meeting a lot of people at the cons. I met a lot of people at TSR over the years. They were really not too far away. We were in the middle of Illinois with
Mm-hmm.
Game Designers Workshop, and TSR was up in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, not too far. Um, and got talking to them about, and kept, I was getting kind of recruited to be either do some writing for them, do some editing for them. They were looking for people who had experience in role playing, and that's it's a siren song. It's like, well, they're a big company. I got to at GDW work a lot on 2300 AD, and then I was involved in some of the development and creation of Space 1889, which
Yeah.
was a lot of fun. I became editor of Challenge magazine for quite a while. But eventually I did succumb, and I thought, well, if I'm going to have a future in this business, at the time I felt like that all roads would lead through TSR if you're going to try to make a living in the role playing game
Yeah.
industry, or the game industry that I was familiar with. And I eventually just got tempted away and made the change. Went up for an interview. I got hired and became a staff writer and editor in I guess that was 1989
Okay.
is when I got hired over there. And, so yeah, and it was
So
going pretty well. And I moved my family to lovely Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which was quite a change. Loved it up there. It's a beautiful little town.
mhm.
And, it's, and honestly, one of its claims to fame is
Yeah.
that Gary Gygax and his team brought role playing to life. And
Yeah.
the town, if you know the town, you know the very houses that they lived in where some of the earliest games were played, the horticultural hall where all the early Gen Cons were originally held. And there's a little historicity there, and it was fun. But by the time I arrived, it was a far more corporate environment. And it was a very large staff. I think at one point they had as many as 300 people on staff there. I think when I was hired on, it was down to just about 150.
Now is
That was
that
still
the
enormous.
yeah, is that the Lorraine Williams 2E era?
It was, yes.
Yeah.
By the time I got on board, the second edition of the game, pioneered mainly by Zeb Cook, but pretty much all the main designers had a hand in that. That second edition of the game was out, and that's all the products that we were working on. That was
Mhm.
the great second edition era, where all the worlds that were coming out were basically aligned with that. And when I came on board, there was, of course, uh, Greyhawk, and then Dragonlance was out, and they had already started publishing products for Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms,
Yep.
and all of these were second edition games and settings, I should say, and they were all doing pretty well. And I got in and started doing some editorial and design work on some of those, and then also some ancillary things like Top Secret that was still going on at the time.
Yep.
Um, the incarnation of the Buck Rogers stuff that was going on at that time. I got involved with that. Basically, as a fairly junior guy, I got handed a lot of junior guy tasks, if you will, and I had no problem with that. I was glad to work on all of that. But oddly, uh, and historically, nobody can really put any rhyme or reason to this. But at some point in about 1990, so I hadn't been there very long, our marketing department got it in their head that the Dragonlance universe was going to kind of run its course. and for some reason, they predicted its demise in 1990. We all know that that was false. It's probably it's popular throughout the history of TSR, even to today, as anything
Yeah.
else. But for some reason, they thought that that world was going to just disappear from a marketing standpoint. And they said, "Hey, design team, we need you to develop some other game setting universe for second edition D&D, AD&D, that's going to replace it." So yeah,
No,
obviously that
easy
never
task, right? Just replace
Yeah.
Dragonlance. Sure.
So yeah, and they said those days we would have these regular design meetings. We were just getting to the point where we were dividing out the company into different product groups, if you will. But at that time, as I recall, there was just a weekly or maybe twice weekly gigantic design meeting to kind of catch up on everything we're doing. We all worked for Jim Ward. He was the director of the department at that time. And then there were all these other great designers, and I'll probably miss some names, but Zeb Cook, Jeff Grubb was in it, and then some recent hires that had worked, like Bruce Nesmith, and then Troy Denning.
Yep.
All these guys were around the building, and I was glad to accept my relatively junior status. But it was Jim Ward who said, he kind of conveyed all this to us. Hey, we need to come up with a new universe, and he said, we're looking who wants to be part of a design team to create what might be the next second edition setting for the game. And I sat back and I thought, well, this is going to go to some people that aren't going to be me, so I'll just continue with what I'm doing. And remarkably, really nobody raised their hands. Now, I think the reason for that is there was a certain amount of burnout in that group who had been through the Gary years and had been through the beginning of the Lorraine Williams years there, and for whatever reason, a lot of them just frankly did not want to fly any closer to the sun than they had to. And therefore didn't really pick it up. And in fact, the only two people in the room at the time who, said, yeah, count me in, were Troy and me. And we started, we got the okay from Jim. I was very surprised to be a part of it. And we started putting together some notes on what we thought frankly, the original title was War World. We thought this would
Ooh.
be a setting that would have just a tremendous amount of conflict going on all of the time. That was sort of the root original draft of some things and notes that we started putting out that slowly evolved into what became Dark Sun. And we would present those, as I recall, like once a week, we would present notes and hand around memos and other things like this and get feedback and whatnot. But um, yeah, in those original days, I mean, it was such a clean slate that we knew we wanted to include a few things, some of which were mandated by the other products that were either just out or in progress at the time. So, for instance, we knew that the complete book of psionics was
Mm-hmm.
about to come out. So it's like, well, this is a natural. We should incorporate that heavily into whatever Dark Sun was going to become. And also the next edition of the Battle System miniatures game that was all
Oh
based
yeah.
around the Relpartha miniatures, and hopefully that was gonna take off and be even a competitor to whatever Games Workshop was doing at the time, which never came to pass. But we thought it might in those days, and therefore we wanted to incorporate battle system in. That was kind of the impetus for a lot of war and conflict in our original thinking. Um, but some things that we knew we wanted to get into this were actually of our own imagination and not dictated by products. As I, first off, uh, we knew we were in a situation where all of the existing D&D universes were fairly Tolkien-esque.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought, well, nobody has really gotten into more of what do I think, sort of a sword and sandal sort of thing, more
Yeah.
of a Conan or anything like that. So we kind of wanted to go more down that line as well. And we thought we would create a universe where all of there'd be humans, but all the other races would be something completely new. So we were actually going to dispense with dwarves and elves and halflings and all of that, just get rid of it, create all new races for this whole new war world situation. And with regard to the former, yeah, we very much got to do more of a Conan-like uh, uh, setting. But the more and more, even that Troy and I talked about it, we were pretty quickly convinced that to go completely away from the existing character races, for instance,
Yeah.
would really alienate people.
Yeah. It would be a
Wouldn't
big
give people as
disconnect.
firm yeah, there wouldn't be that firm grounding that
Yeah.
everybody has. So instead we took that and actually thought, well, okay, well, let's keep them, but let's turn them on their heads. That's where Cannibal Halflings
Cannibal
and
Halflings, one of the
all this
big
stuff
draws.
comes from. Yeah, we traded it all around and really you really messed with all of those races, which I think that ultimately struck a chord with people.
Yeah.
Made it far more interesting, gave it a whole new twist that everybody seemed to like. But yeah, that was pretty much the genesis of that project. And then of course, I can't skip ahead too far. I mean, very quickly we were introduced to a fairly new artist at TSR. It was Gerald Brom, and he got involved in the team as well. And I knew Brom, and I knew some of the other work that he had done at that
Yeah.
point. It was all great, and several of his pieces that predated his time at TSR really had a vibe that we admired. I think the original Neva painting, he made that long before
Yeah.
Dark Sun existed, and we looked at that and said, "Wow! I mean, if you can illustrate things that are sort of along this road, I mean, this should be the look of the thing we're kind of trying to go
Yeah.
for." And he was very on board. And we created a relationship with Brom that was ultimately, I think, unlike any of the other relationships that the writers had with artists up to that point
Oh yeah.
in any role playing company. Which was we wanted a partnership right up front. I mean, we want you to create things that we will describe just as much as we want to invent things that you will illustrate.
Yeah.
And Brom really, I mean, he just dug in. The guy was he was so prolific and just made he just had his sense of style just so fit with the things that we were trying to create that it was just it was just magical to see him creating all of the original cover paintings and all of like that, and working with him, and then yeah, we just it was a terrific collaboration, one that we love to this day. And then also we got to give credit where it is due. Mary Kirchhoff, who was head of the book department at the time, she sat with Troy, and they outlined and did a lot for the basic creation of the universe, with an eye towards creating the eventual novels. It started out with Troy, who wrote all the Prison Pen Tad stuff, and then further books from him, and then on to the works that Lynn Abbey created for the
Yeah.
line. So it seemed like, prior to Dark Sun, I mean, so many of the components and elements were in place, but we got to refine all of these processes and the kinds of products that were
Yeah.
being created and the kinds of vehicles by which the stories would be told, and got to put them all together into one sort of more unified approach, from a sense of making sure it's all available sort of in a timely manner, that it's got a unique trade dress where when it gets out into game stores and bookstores, which were important back then,
Yeah.
kids,
Yeah.
because they're not so important now.
Not
But
so much.
when they get on a shelf, it would look sort of like the shelf behind you, and you would see that this whole section of stuff, wow, it all sort of looks alike. It's all
Yeah.
part of this same compelling universe at a glance, and that had never really been done to that point.
And then like going forward, right? I think Dark Sun, Birthright, and then kind of at the end of
Mhm.
the life cycle, Planescape were the only ones. I mean, I can look at my shelf. I'm all my two ebooks like right there, and looking at the shelf, those are the three lines that instantly still stand out to me. Because and again, like you guys in Brahm and the Planescape team, and with I can never pronounce his name, Tony
Ditterlitzy?
Detterlitzy, there we go. Like
Yes,
that was
Bill Tony.
Yeah. And that's actually something that we even do today with our artists that we work with like Bob, getting this stuff and having a unified look, but also having a conversation back and forth. Anon in the chat just said, working with illustrators work best as a conversation rather than a commission. It's true.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. Yeah, not to fault previous days or things, but before Dark Sun, when anytime it's time to get an art order together, it was just, I would create a written piece document that says, hey, we need to illustrate this and something for that and something for that. It would go away into, frankly, a black box from my point of view, and there wasn't really much of a relationship.
Yeah.
What I got back is like, okay, this will work. Please change that. But once you can, sit down and actually chat with the artist, and to their credit, when they created Dragonlance before my time at TSR, I think the team that put all of that together and worked with all the artists back there, Larry Elmore and everybody else.
Oh yeah.
Clyde Caldwell, Parkinson. Those they really did a lot to create the initial look for that as a great conversation among creators. But again, we stand on those shoulders when we got to create the relationships for Dark Sun as well. So
now you listen.
Yeah, it was great.
You listen, Conan is one of the inspirations. And I think that's what drew me to Dark Sun. Is it definitely felt more Conan, John Carter of Mars. It was. Yeah. We're definitely going to use the 5D4 for attributes as the 3D6 to kind of give you a little bit stronger of a character. Hey, you're going to start at level 4 because this is a deadly world.
Right. You're gonna get killed. Yeah, that was that's kind of a ploy. I mean, that almost plays right out of Traveler. You might die in character generation, which was that was great.
I don't know if you've ever seen them. They've got T-shirts that say I made a character in Traveler, and all I got was this T-shirt because he died.
Mark runs that at conventions, I think, to this day, and gets a lot of good feedback on. So that's kind of fun. But it was meant to be tough. I mean, we wanted to create some, I don't know, marketing buzz, if you will. What's this going to be like? Why would anybody want to get involved with this, especially from a relatively new design team, et cetera. But it went out, and it had really, another thing we did all advertising in those days was done in Dragon magazine,
Mhm.
essentially, which was important back then, kids. Magazines were important to how you launched a game, and
Now,
we really did a series.
a magazine's like a book, but it's really
It's like
small, and it would come to your house like once a month, or you would have to go and
right,
go to the store and pick one up.
right,
So it's like a slim book that was printed on worse
right,
paper.
right. Well, TSR was the giant of the industry in those
Yeah.
days. Their magazine was the giant of all
Mhm.
marketing for any kind of a new game in that field. And the team put together, I can't take credit, but our marketing team, and we worked with them to create a whole series of sort of teaser ads that were leading up to the release of Dark Sun. And by the time that all came out, there was quite a buzz for it. It sold a tremendous amount. I think it was a record-setting set of sales numbers for its first year were off the charts, and yeah, we were off to the races. It was a ton of fun. Ton of fun. Then we got to do all these follow-on products, and there was a lot of it. So
So I've always wanted to ask you, and I realize I've had the
yeah,
opportunity to ask you this many times,
probably true.
but so
What's on your mind?
let's talk about the preservers and the defilers. And to
Yeah.
me, they're always felt so there's this very
Hmm.
ecologically important component of Dark Sun. And I'll let you, like, if you can just describe the
Sure.
ecological disaster that happened in Dark Sun. I've always felt like there's a very heavy Dune relationship, right? Because Dune is very
Yeah.
ecologically focused. Dark Sun also as well. So can you like overview for people who are like, what's a Dark Sun?
Sure.
What that disaster was, and then how you guys, how did the preservers and defilers kind of evolve?
Sure. I in my in my original thinking of even coming up with the name Dark Sun, I thought that we would incorporate something where basically ancient scientists. None of this ever made print, so it never became
Yeah, this
any
was
part of
all,
the
yeah.
background. This is all just in my head that never went anywhere. But the ancient scientists or whatever were so desperate to make something happen that they thought it would be a good idea to tamper with the very nature of their star, and in altering it, it led to this huge ecological disaster. That did not make it into the lexicon, so that's not it. But that sort of thing was in the back of my head. I wanted kind of an ecological element to the game, um, and I wanted to combine that with my the way I view magic in a fantasy setting is always that magic ought to be a little more dangerous, ought to
Mm-hmm.
have ramifications, that tapping into magic ought to be a process rather than sort of automatic. Like just there's really just in the basic Dungeons and Dragons first and second edition game, you just have the spell, you cast it, that's the end of it. There's
Yep.
nothing else happens. So I wanted to create something in Dark Sun that would reflect that my temperament with regard to that. So and that played into um, the whole ecological thing when I thought, well, I would create two approaches to magic. One more cautious,
Mm-hmm.
which takes time and effort and is more difficult, but doesn't create an ecological problem. But the easier way into magic is to I don't care. I'm going to cast a spell, and in so doing, it creates a problem. And in Dark Sun, it just wipes out around the caster. It just wiped out a certain amount of
Yeah.
the living material that is there. The bigger the spell, the more you wipe out. And again, I don't think we really spelled this out, but overuse of easy magic, defiler style magic,
Yeah.
is ultimately, in my mind, what led to the destruction of the planet, down to where there's just this little bit of it left that's even worth trying to preserve, and,
Right.
and and could be the genesis to carry on. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. I think that struck a chord as
Yeah.
well. I think you know uh, having an ecological bit of content in there was important at the time. I'm not sure it's really even changed now. If anything, it's certainly more in the news, more part of
Yeah.
our lives. But it's all a metaphor, right? For for our modern society, and how do we face these same questions, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it turned the game into something where um, you've got to make some choices and decisions about magic use that you never had to before,
Right.
and it made things just a little more gritty, a little compelling. So I enjoyed that.
So the other thing that's stands out about Dark Sun to me is it was the only game line that I can think of. I I'm looking. I don't think anyone else did this. You had the flip books in the box set, the spiral
Yeah,
bound. What was
right,
the thought process behind? They were super useful because they would lay flat at the table. You could open
right.
to the page that you needed. Everything else was sort of either perfect bound or, what we're still used to in the gaming industry.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the Dark Sun experiment that kind of had its good and its bad.
Yeah.
Um, the idea was to create a new approach to creating an adventure where we could take better advantage of all of this great art that we're getting from Brahm and others who are emulating Brahm, like Baxa and everything else. But
Yeah.
the idea, we had all this great art, and any other role playing book, and most of them even today, the art is sitting in that volume. And if you want to show it to the players, you hold the book up to the players, and they get to see that for a moment, and then you take it back and you use the book for your own uh, game mastering purposes. So we thought, what if we created a style of adventures where on any given encounter, you've got sort of a tented thing where the art is on permanent display to the players to give them that feel of the encounter. But the details from a game master's point of view, dungeon master's
It's
point of
facing
view,
you.
we're facing him. So we worked with manufacturing and figured out how to do these spiral bound books that would tent up and work that way. We made a couple of sample adventures that way, and they
Hmm.
seemed to play test out pretty well. And for the most part, from that point of view, they worked really well. I think they played well. They were easy to design to, and a lot of those adventures, they tended to sell really well, and which is kind of our measure in those days of whether or not people
Right.
liked it. We didn't have instant internet feedback. See, kids, before the internet, you would have to actually see people and talk to them to find out what they thought of your stuff,
Hmm.
instead of having it, you know, emailed to you by ad nauseum permanently. But so yeah, we thought we got good feedback when we did get it. The downside of that was primarily in manufacturing. Uh, the price of making such things as those was continued to rise even in those days, which was not good. And the original packaging for those adventures was a relatively light paper box that
Hmm.
would hold all the components in place. And the bad news was that those did not deliver well, and the shopware on those was out of control. In hindsight, we should have used a heavier box, but that would have increased the price. Um, but we got so much of that stuff come back as returns, especially from the book trade. It just made them impractical. After we did it,
Yeah.
we probably did about a dozen of those adventures, and then had to
Yeah.
get out of that sphere. As I think the concept was fairly novel and received, but from a manufacturing and selling through the stores standpoint, it just wasn't practical. And we took it in the teeth on some of those, because when Random House would make returns, I mean, that's just stuff comes back in great big trailers, and that's it. You didn't sell it, and there's nothing you can do with it. So
Yeah.
they would just get too crushed and banged up, and yeah, they didn't look good on the shelf after that. So you
I,
live and you learn.
I have heard horror stories about that from that time at TSR. That was sort of the death knell, or one of the major nails was the book returns that would come in. Just
Well, that's part of it. We Back in those days, we TSR had such a great relationship with Random House that in the end was probably abused, and that's a subject for
yeah, we don't want.
another interview. But the nature of the book trade then, and even now, was that the book trade you sell in on what's called a returnable basis.
Mm-hmm.
Once more for the kids, which means the product basically gets bought by Random House, put into the bookstores, but if it doesn't sell, they get to send it back, and then they want their money back. So no sale really occurred if the stuff comes back. And that was just a part of doing business with the book trade, and something everybody has to live with if you're going to sell through that channel. It's traditional. You're never going to get past it. Excuse me. Yeah, when returns would come, it was inevitable that returns would come, whether it's shop worn or whatever reason they wanted to return it. All of these books would come back in. And whenever that would happen, word would go out. There's a whole new truckload of semi-damaged TSR material just for the taking. If you wanted to go down there and just load up your car, and many people did. And I looked at those people like they were some kind of fools. What do you want all of this shop worn, bent up books in your? Well, I didn't know a thing was going to come along called eBay, kids. I didn't know that was going to happen. And if I had, I'd have bought a warehouse
and just stored it
filled
all.
with stuff. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, who knew, right? Didn't know that was coming. But yeah, so all that stuff was free for the taking, and so many materials came through, which yeah, it was nuts.
So there have been several discussions online that kind of said in today's kind of climate, Dark Sun could never be re-brought back. Dark Sun had, you guys put the dark in Dark Sun, right? There's slavery, there's war, there's abuse, there's cannibal halflings. We mentioned cannibal halflings.
Right.
Cannibal halflings are sort of the ducks. Like cannibal halflings are to Dark Sun as ducks are to Glorantha. But you and I have talked extensively about this, and it was never your intent to glorify any of this stuff. You just were like, I want a need for heroes. Can you talk about like baking in that need for heroes with this sort of like inherent darkness that is sort of, quintessential to the Dark Sun experience?
So, so much of the original thinking was based upon, well, I think we want to start a story that basically starts with, things have gotten bad, they've gotten bad, and the stories all start with the big turnaround where Rikus, in a very Spartacus kind of way, leads the great slave revolt that starts things back. So, slavery is the big issue that no one would touch today in a role-playing game with a 10-foot pole. Yeah. Because, we're in the middle of, all of that here in the real world for how we talk about that amongst ourselves. But for us, it was just really simple that it's a world that had been largely taken over by evil, and the characters are now fighting against that evil to set things back on a better stance. And we always just, we never gave it a lot of thought at that point. No one came out and said, "Oh, we can't put this." It was a different time.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, we just make it clear that the players in this world are the heroes.
They're the heroes.
You're fighting against these things.
Yeah.
Just as if you're, goblins are evil, right? They run off with your children and they do these terrible, terrible things, and they're inherently evil. The heroes fight against that. And sometimes now you fight against other humans who are doing evil things to other humans. But we always just just put it out there that the player characters in Dark Sun, you are the heroes.
Yeah.
Heroes fighting to get the world back to a better age. And in those days that was enough. But I just think today, nobody wants to.
It's a stickier situation.
Well, it's stickier, and again, back then, remember, kids, just letters and occasional contact with fans. Now, it goes right out on social media, and 40 million people with their, 40, or thousands of people with their opinions come out and flame everything that they don't like, and then start flaming each other. And that's why you won't find me on social media, kids. Just saying. Don't go looking. You won't find me. But again, no issue really in the day. We kind of knew we just take that stance, but Today it'd be nuts, which is, it's probably why they haven't reissued the game.
That's
It's probably
kind
gonna
of
live in a drawer forever,
well.
which is kind of a shame, but
Let's talk about that, because you at one point wanted to get Dark Sun back, and when that door was closed, you launched
yeah.
a spiritual successor.
Yeah, I was a part of, back in the day. We had 3 different times we put together groups that wanted to buy or buy back from TSR or license from TSR the rights to do a relaunch of Dark Sun itself.
Yeah.
And in each case, we were rebuffed. And sometimes there was a lot of key people and money on the table to make it happen, but it was refused every time nonetheless. Now, there could be a variety of reasons for that, but anyway, that's how it went down. And so that left me, it's like, well, if I ever really want to explore those themes again, I'm going to have to basically do it in my own way.
Yeah.
And that's why I thought, well, over the years, of course, I had a lot of different ideas of how we could have done Dark Sun differently, or things that I maybe wanted to see in the game that just didn't make it for the group dynamic to become part of the game. And so I put together my own Dragon Kings universe, which ran a Kickstarter for about 10 years ago and had a little bit of success with it. And I think it was a lot of fun. Publishing when you haven't got a great big company behind you is a very different thing.
It's a very different thing.
So I've got some fans that enjoy that. I'd like to do more with that with Strange Owl Games here, just as soon as we can get that together. And JM, you and I have worked on it quite a bit. We have a new edition of all of that coming up for release probably into 2025, because I fall behind. Are we 2024?
We're 2024 this whole year.
Quickly, yes, thank you. Yeah, that's something we'll bring out then. And while it's not Dark Sun, it carries a lot of the same themes and has some different approaches as to why Magic is different and difficult and complicated and possibly harmful to cast. Which again, I've just taken a lot of that from literature, and I can't take credit for that, but I like to feel that I'm helping put that into a game form that people can actually toy with and enjoy. But
well, and what's interesting to me about Dark Sun versus Dragon Kings is Dark Sun is well after the massive disaster that has rendered the planet the way it is. You're kind of fighting over the remnants, as you said. Dragon Kings were just a couple of years, if not a decade, away from the slow decline, kind of kicking over into that actual disaster that's going to then desolate the entire world. So that's always been a fun difference between the two for me, and I've really enjoyed working on Dragon Kings with you. Got to get another playtest going of that. Revisit the document, and as we kind of get that all pulled together. Well, Tim, this was awesome. Thanks for coming and talking about Dark Sun.
Absolutely, yeah, it's my pleasure. I can go on for days.
We'll have to have you back.
I got it. Well, I've had a great life in the gaming industry. It's been a big part of everything that I've done, and it's given me a terrific career. And I get to make games and have fun most of the time. Which, again, kids, when you got to write a big manuscript, that's work.
That's
okay. It's got to knuckle down and do it. But it's still working on something that I have passion for and a lot of fun. So thanks to everybody. It's been a fan of my work, and it's my pleasure to be on the show.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thank you so much. We're going to do more beyond the tables on a monthly basis. I've got a couple of people lined up. As soon as I get those signed up, I'll let the patrons know over at patreon.com/iconic. If you want to support Tim's and my work with Strange Owl, we've got Space 1889 out. We're in the process of getting Amboria out. We've got big things coming towards the end of this year for our third project. You can head over to patreon.com/Strange Owl Games and become a part of our Patreon there. Every month, Richard is putting out fun new content for the fans of Amboria, and we will be sending those out. Sorry, Tink, don't have a link handy. Next time, I'll put a link in the show notes. So, Tim, thank you so much. This was awesome.
JM, thanks for having me. Take care.
All right, everybody. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. This has been Beyond the Table, and I am JM. This has been with Timothy Brian Brown. We've been talking about Dark Sun. Have a good one.